I just want to preface this video by saying something important beforehand. There are a lot of names in this video. Some of them I said wrong. So, when you hear me say them, they're probably going to sound wrong. If you look at the bottom where the text is with the names, those are correct. I've checked them 3, 4 times, 5 times, and I've spelled them all correctly. I know for a fact I said some of them wrong, and that's just because I'm an idiot. So, without further ado, here we go.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Oh, yeah. You earned it all right.
Welcome back. I know you all were waiting for the second portion of the video, and I planned to have it posted right after the first. However, with this nationwide quarantine, it made me realize how much I need to rework the video. Also, if you haven't seen the first part of this, I suggest you check that out before watching this video. Are you ready? Because here we go. The biggest blunder in recent presidential history, the Watergate Scandal. The date is June 17th, 1972. It's around 2:30 in the morning. A group of men, now referred to as the Plumbers, are arrested as they break into the Watergate building complex, planting surveillance bugs in offices of the Democratic National Committee. In the eyes of the layman, it would look like a regular burglary attempt gone wrong, but something stuck out about these individuals. Their equipment found on them during the arrests. These gentlemen carried with them almost $2,300, most in $100 bills with the serial numbers of each in sequence, a shortwave receiver, which could pick up police calls on the radio, 40 rolls of unexposed film, 2 35mm cameras, and 3 pen-sized tear gas guns. This was extremely suspicious, as if they were hired by someone who had access to the U.S. Mint and materials necessary to plot against the Democratic Party. But that's not all. 3 days later, on June 20th, a secret source who went by the name Deep Throat, yes, I'm not kidding, that was the legit name he chose, it was the 70s, innuendos like that didn't exist, so sue me, spoke to Bob Woodward of the Washington Post that one of the burglars had CIA intelligence officer Howard Hunt in his address book and had checks signed by Hunt. Things were starting to get a little suspicious. A couple months later, on September 15th, Hunt, FBI agent Gordon Liddy, and the 5 burglars were indicted by a federal grand jury and in January would all plead guilty on charges of conspiracy, burglary, and violation of federal wiretapping laws. While all this was taking place, Nixon will be re-elected in 1972 and a cover-up would begin, trying to remove the tracks that the Nixon administration had left. But there was a trail of cashier's checks leading investigators from one of the burglars, Bernard Baker, to Kenneth H. Dahlberg, who was part of the finance committee to re-elect the president. The checks were 1972 campaign donations. As investigators began to take a closer look at Mr. Baker's finances, they noticed he had many separate bank accounts, used to mask the true origin of these checks being deposited in his accounts. But unfortunately for Baker and others involved, a transcript of about 6 months of transactions showed that Baker had moved money in and out of foreign and domestic accounts. These checks had come from Gordon Liddy, who was ordered by Deputy Director Jeb Magruder and Finance Director Maurice Stans to deposit them, which were signed by the Treasurer of the CRP, Committee to Re-elect the President, Hugh Sloan, who failed to keep track of where the money was being deposited. Because of all this deep-rooted conspiracy, Judge John Circa began to suspect that this would reach the top of the executive branch, and Nixon would be at the helm of the operation. It wouldn't be much longer that things began to look bad for Nixon. On March 17, 1973, James McCord, who had been convicted, sent a letter to Judge Circa stating that some of his testimony was perjured under pressure by other government officials. He did not clarify who these officials were, but stated it was not a CIA operation. This led an investigation into the White House. In April, White House counsel John Dean began to cooperate with prosecutors.
What I had hoped to do in this conversation was to have the president tell me we had to end the matter now. Accordingly, I gave considerable thought to how I would present this situation to the president and try to make as dramatic a presentation as I could to tell him how serious I thought the situation was that the cover-up continue. I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
At this point, Nixon thought it would be best to distance himself from Watergate. So, on April 30th, Nixon requested the resignation of administration officials John Ehrlichman, Bob Haldeman, and Richard Kleindienst. I think that's how you say it, while at the same time firing John Dean. It was around this time that John Dean informed the prosecutors that he had discussed the cover-up with Nixon at least 35 times.
I don't know how many other people on the White House staff knew of the conspiracy to, not my conspiracy, but the general cover-up conspiracy. I certainly know that I was getting instructions from Mr. Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and I know of my conversations with the president. I know that there were other people on the staff who were quite aware of the fact that the White House was not burying its soul in this matter.
Did you take any notes of this meeting?
Of the September 15th meeting?
Yes, sir.
No, sir, and I didn't take notes of other meetings, and for a very specific reason. I recall at one time Mr. Moore saying to me, "John, you're having a lot of meetings with the president. You ought to be recording these." Some of the things that were being discussed in these meetings, I didn't want to make records of, Senator.
Why, sir?
I thought they were very incriminating to the President of the United States.
And the noose began to tighten. Following Dean's testimony, former presidential appointment secretary Alexander Butterfield told the prosecution that all conversations and phone calls made by Nixon had been recorded since 1971.
You know, if I was the president, and I was saying some things that maybe I shouldn't be saying or talking about, I don't know, in my office, I would think about, what about that taping system we put in a couple years ago? Should I pull that out? Yeah, I should probably pull that out.
It was following this that Nixon ordered the White House taping system to be disconnected, and he was asked to hand over all the tapes made. Nixon refused. Vice President Agnew was also under investigation for corruption charges back when he was governor of Maryland and resigned on October 10th.
Good evening. Vice President Agnew, burying himself as a tax cheat, resigned today under an agreement which protects him from prosecution on charges of grafting. And a federal prosecutor brought in from Chicago especially to deal with the Agnew case said, "I have never seen a stronger case of bribery or extortion."
Following this, Gerald Ford became the vice president under the 25th Amendment on December 6th. To give a summary of Ford as a person, here's some clips I found of him over the years.
I'm Gerald Ford, and you're not.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
You serious?
Another fun fact about Ford is that the man played football back in his early days. So I'm under the impression that he probably knocked a few screws loose back then. Most likely.
Also, Nixon, in one of his passing statements, called Ford, and I quote, a dumb shit. So you can say that the president did not have much of a favorable opinion toward his VP. Only a couple days after this, an event now called the Saturday Night Massacre takes place on October 20th, 1973. A basic summary goes like this. Nixon, feeling extreme pressure, wanted to remove Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox from the investigation. So, he asks Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refuses, so Nixon fires him. Nixon asks William Ruckelshaw, Liddy's replacement, to fire Cox. He also refuses, and is fired as well. Finally, Nixon asked Robert Bork to fire Cox, and he complied. This was all broadcasted on late-night television, showing complete disregard for secrecy needed in such a massive cover-up.
More than 50,000 telegrams poured in on Capitol Hill today. So many, Western Union was swamped. Most of them demanded impeaching Mr. Nixon.
These come from Republicans and businessmen and people, most of whom begin their statement by saying, I've supported the president, I've never believed in impeachment, but he's now gone too far, and we want the Congress to take strong action.
In my 3 district offices in the 1 Republican area, my phone calls were 100 to 1 in favor of pursuing the path of impeachment, which was rather shocking to me.
At this point, associate after associate of Nixon is indicted on charges of corruption. There are literally so many names that I really can't keep up with who still works in the White House at this point. After months of convictions, Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski orders that the White House tapes be handed over on April 16, 1974. The White House decides to hand over edited versions of the tapes, but the House Judiciary Committee is having none of it, and demands the full, uncut tapes and begins impeachment proceedings on May 9th. The United States versus Nixon impeachment proceedings ends on July 24th, and the House Judiciary Committee passes articles of impeachment on July 30th. Nixon remained adamant through this entire thing that he had no knowledge of the break-in whatsoever. But that was until a secret tape recorded on June 23rd, 1972 was discovered. On that tape was a conversation between Nixon and Haldeman discussing the break-in, which had just occurred a couple days before.
On the investigation, the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control it. And their investigation is now leading into some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank sources, and the banker stuff, and it goes some directions we don't want it to go. Also, there have been some things like an informant came in off the street to the FBI in Miami with a photographer who has a friend who's a photographer who developed some films for this guy Parker, and the films had pictures of Democratic National Committee letterhead documents and things. So there's things like that that are filtering in. Mitchell came up with yesterday, and John Dean analyzed very carefully last night and concurs now with Mitchell's recommendation that the only way to solve this, and we're set up beautifully to do it, the only network that paid any attention to last night was NBC, who did a massive story on the Cuban thing.
This became known as the smoking gun tape, and Nixon knew he was done for. Even Republican senators told him that if the articles of impeachment made it to the Senate, he was going to be convicted. He basically had no one on his side at this point. With all this overwhelming evidence, on August 8th, 1974, Nixon informs the American public that he will resign from his position as president.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad. To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the president and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
And just like that, Nixon is vilified and becomes known as the crooked president of the United States.
We think sometimes when things happen that don't go the right way, We think that when you don't pass the bar exam the first time, I happened to, but I was just lucky. I mean, my writing was so poor, the bar examiner said, we just got to let the guy through. We think that when someone dear to us dies, we think that when we lose an election, we think that when we suffer a defeat, that all is ended. We think, as T.R. said, that the light had left his life forever. Not true. It's only a beginning, always. The young must know it. The old must know it. It must always sustain us, because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes, and you're really tested, when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
So, what happens from here? The following day, on August 9th, Nixon leaves the White House and is photographed giving his famous double V wave and says goodbye to the position that he had worked so hard for. On September 8th, President Ford ends the investigation against Nixon and pardons him for any wrongdoing that he may have committed while he was in office.
Now therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
I'd say he got off pretty light. This event changed the public's perception of the White House and the presidency overall. People began to scrutinize their elected officials more frequently and didn't automatically trust the government as they did for so many years before. I mean, if you look back at Truman, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, people just kind of went along with it until around the time Vietnam was going on. And then this. It's basically just a big bomb blown up in your face. Ford doesn't last long as president, and in the election of 1976, loses to a peanut farmer and senator from Georgia, Jimmy Carter. From this point on, Nixon becomes a joke president. His famous looks and mannerisms become a punchline of many jokes for decades, even to this very day.
Who's kicking who around now?
It would take many years for people to look positively on Nixon again, but eventually the public warmed up to the man who was, the man in the arena, the political powerhouse known as Tricky Dick Nixon.
Now that we've reached the end of the video, I think one of the most important things to say is that I don't believe Nixon was right in anything that he did. I do believe there was a cover-up. In saying that, I want to clarify something that I also believe. I believe gentlemen such as Ehrlichman and Haldeman were, in a sense, wolves, political wolves. And they, whatever the president said, they did with ferocious nature. And other individuals that were involved, such as McCord and Magruder, not so much Magruder, but a lot of other individuals, just when the president says something, they don't just say yes, they go ahead and slit the throat. That's pretty much how they work. It was a very different time back then. And I don't say that he was right in any way, but I do want to say that he is a very interesting man, a very charismatic man when he wants to be. And I think that he was given a raw deal in some instances. But you can disagree with me, that's fine. It's politics. It's not something I like to argue in these videos a lot, because I don't think it's important to argue about that kind of stuff. I think it's important to lay out the facts. So, now that I have said that, I also want to mention that I've decided to change up my formatting when I do these videos. As you can see, I put my face in front of the camera now, disheveled or not. I think it's very important that I do something a little different, because it has become a little difficult to find a lot of footage on some of these issues, and also prefacing a video at the end of another video is a little difficult, because sometimes I do it on a whim and I can't find the information that I'm looking for. Like with Watergate, it took a lot more pictures than it took video, because there's only so much I can find. So I'm going to format things a little differently, maybe try a different video here and there, but I'm going to keep putting out videos. This video obviously took way longer than it needed to, and I blame myself for that. Only me. Nobody else but me. I had plenty of time during this pandemic, and I just wasted it. So from now on, I'm going to try a different approach. I'm going to put together maybe different types of videos, all history related, of course, just different formatting, different style, try to do something and you know, flesh out what I've created here so far. It's not much, it's small, but it is something that I've created on my own. So I'd like to say here, thank you all for watching, and I hope to have you guys watch the next video that comes up.